Hi Steinbeck fans, my name is Lisa. I'm the archivist for the National Steinbeck Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the ongoing series, Steinbeck's PHALANX. In this series, we are focusing on the relationships in Steinbeck's life and how these people influenced Steinbeck and his writing. Now, before we get started, I'd like to remind you all that tickets are now on sale for the National Steinbeck Center's virtual Steinbeck Festival. Come join us August 2nd, 1st and 2nd of 2020 for fun panels, discussions, lectures, music, and games. You can join me on Saturday night for Steinbeck-themed bingo. Now, let's dive into the life of Edward Flanders Ricketts. Ed Ricketts was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1897. He writes about himself in 1942. At the age of 6, I was ruined for any ordinary activities when an uncle, who should have known better, gave me some natural history curios and an old zoology textbook. Here I saw for the first time those magic and incorrect words, coral insects. Now, the Ricketts family lived mostly in Chicago, except for a year when they moved to South Dakota. They didn't stay long since Ricketts' mother didn't particularly like the arrangement, but it certainly added to young Ricketts' love of animals and the outdoors. Back in Chicago, Ricketts picked up his love of poetry by reading Walt Whitman. You notice I have issues. I'm trying to say Steinbeck when I mean Ricketts. I apologize for that. So Ed's higher education might sound a bit familiar to Steinbeck fans. He started at Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois, and then dropped out, taking a series of odd jobs before being briefly drafted into the Army. After discharge, Ed enrolled at the University of Chicago to study philosophy, Spanish, and, of course, biology. Again, he took some time off, this time to walk around the Midwest and southeastern United States, a walk memorialized in Cannery Row. He finally did return to the University of Chicago, where he met Warder Clyde Alley, one of America's first ecologists. Now, we take a lot of ecology for granted today, but in this period of biological study, a lot of pioneering work was being done in studying groups of animals, areas of habitats, and the relationships between different species. For Ed, he found one of the best teachers to study this kind of work, and it deeply influenced him throughout his life. In the end, Ed left the university without a degree. He moved out to Pacific Grove and joined a friend of his, Gallagher, in running Pacific Biological Laboratories. Now, when the pair first started their work out in Pacific Grove, they could be seen at odd hours with jars in the tide pools. Locals called the police, thinking that they were bootleggers. Of course, they weren't. And eventually Gallagher left the business in 1924, leaving Ed to run it on his own. And Ed often got help from friends and family members in filling orders. 1930 was the year that changed everything. John and Carol Steinbeck moved to the Steinbeck family cottage at 11th Street in Pacific Grove. Now, I found a few stories for how Steinbeck and Ricketts met for the first time. One says that it was in the waiting room of a dentist's office, though a lot of Steinbeck scholars think this was just a long-running joke between Ricketts and Steinbeck, and the more accepted version says that they met in the home of Jack Kelvin, a mutual friend. However they met, a friendship bloomed between them. They had a lot of overlapping interests. Steinbeck certainly had an interest in biology and other sciences that predated his friendship with Ricketts. He enrolled in classes at Hopkins Marine Stations as early as 1923. But with Ricketts, he could indulge this interest more systemically and more regularly. Steinbeck and Ricketts also had an interest in how individuals operated in a group, whether it was a tide pool community or a human one. And they also shared this interest in Nonteleological thinking. This is the concept of focusing on what is, rather than how or why it is a particular way. This is very useful to Ricketts as a scientist studying marine communities and sharpened his observational skills, but it also showed up in Steinbeck's works. Of Mice and Men was initially entitled Something That Happened. It embodies this idea of non-teleological thinking. Characters act and react as they do. There's no time spent looking at why they're reacting the way they do, and there's no real hero and no real villain. Now, throughout the 1930s, Steinbeck and Ricketts socialized regularly. There was an entire social group that focused on the lab. This group didn't have a lot of money, it being the 1930s, and which made sitting around and talking, reading Ed's books, listening to Ed's music, and long discussions on poetry, philosophy, and anything else that came to mind. This was all very appealing at the time. Now, one of the tragedies did strike Ed Ricketts' life at this period as well. In November 1936, an electrical problem at the next neighboring Del Mar cannery set his little lab ablaze. And to add insult to injury, although Ricketts estimated his losses around $12,000, he was only paid around $3,000 by the electric company. The big loss for him was his library as far as he was concerned. And a month later, that Christmas, a lot of friends got together to try and re-gift him some of his new copies of some of his favorite volumes to rebuild what he had lost. This is also shortly after John and Carol moved to Los Gatos, depriving Ricketts of the day-to-day companionship of one of his friends. However, the pair were reunited again in 1940 for the Sea of Cortez trip. Now, initially, the pair planned on this being one of 3 trips to Mexico, San Francisco Bay, and the Pacific Northwest. The goal was to produce a broad outline of the Pacific coast, mapped and explored with reference to marine animals that could be found in each ecological zone. Of course, the project never panned out, though we are lucky to have what we do in The Sea of Cortez, a leisurely journal of travel and research. I highly recommend reading it. This project was deeply satisfying for both of them as well. The collecting trip brought 35 new species to scientific awareness, which was incredibly satisfying for Ricketts, and it also gave Steinbeck a chance to experiment with his writing. He tried out what you might call scientific creative nonfiction, and particularly after the rigors of The Grapes of Wrath, this was a refreshing change for Steinbeck. Now, Steinbeck eventually left California, going to Mexico and then to New York, working on new projects, and finally going to Europe as a war correspondent. So Ricketts and Steinbeck saw less of each other through the early 1940s. And of course, Steinbeck and Ricketts' friendship came to an abrupt end in 1948, when Ed's car was hit by the Del Monte Express passing near Cannery Row. Steinbeck was deeply affected by Ed's accident and passing. He said to another friend in a letter, "The greatest man in the world is dying, and there is nothing I can do." And many of Steinbeck's letters from this post-period after Ricketts' passing mention him and talking about how he feels about the loss of his good friend. And to Bo Beskow, a friend of Steinbeck's and Swedish artist, he wrote that Bo now filled that great man role in Steinbeck's life. Now, in terms of Steinbeck's work and writing, one of the most notable features of many of his novels is what you might call an Ed-like character. The Doctor in Dubious Battle, Doc Winter in The Moon is Down, Preacher Casey in The Grapes of Wrath, and of course, Doc in Cannery Row. However, I usually try to remind people that these characters are not the same as Ed Ricketts. Literary characters have a role to fulfill and a job to do in the course of a narrative, and people don't have that kind of job or role to fill. They just are. And that's why I like to say Ed-like, because of course no one could be Ed Ricketts. No one else could fill that role. And until next time, happy reading.